We live in an age of 7-day-a-week, wall-to-wall sport. This sport often comes packaged in bizarre, difficult-to-understand formats, like fourth-placed teams in pools of 6 qualifying for the knockouts. Such idiosyncrasies can be summarized in a word: hypertrophy, otherwise known as exaggerated growth or complexity. Hypertrophy in sport leads to all kinds of bad things, including cynicism and match-fixing. And cynicism and match-fixing is the antithesis of all that we hold sacred in sport. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. I'm writing this directly after the FA Cup third round in the first Champions Cup fixtures of the new year. The two tournaments aren't chosen at random, as we will hear about shortly. Started in 1871, with the first final played in March of the following year, the Football Association Challenge Cup, or FA Cup, as it is more commonly known, is a fine example of an old, relatively consistent tournament, certainly in terms of format. The competition's first goal was scored by one Jarvis Kenrick, a trainee solicitor and keen amateur photographer, when he netted for Clapham Rovers in their 3-0 win over Upton Park. That was way back in, wait for it, November 1871. Contrast this with the Champions Cup, the third round of which was played on the same weekend as the third round of the FA Cup. The Champions Cup, Europe's premier rugby competition, is now reaching the end of the round-robin phase. It's a competition, for reasons which we will try to divine later, which has, and I choose my words carefully, a peculiar format. The first thing to notice here is that the teams, divided into 4 pools of 6, don't play 5 matches in their group, as might be expected. They only play 4. After the preliminary 4 matches are over, the top 4 teams of the 6 catapult into the round of 16, by which point the Champions Cup becomes a knockout tournament. To many, the idea that a team who finish 4th out of 6, in the bottom half of the table, in other words, should be rewarded with a place in the round of 16 is strange. Some might go further and say that it is simply cynical. This slightly abstract point will take on a practical application in the next week when we see who the 4 fourth-placed teams in the 4 groups are. 2 of those teams could be the Stormers and the Sharks, in which case their fans are unlikely to be bleating about the fine print of competition format. They will simply thank their lucky stars that they have been given a second chance to stay in the competition they clearly weren't very good at staying in the first place. Their fans will rightly point out, of course, that both teams have been waging parallel campaigns, first in the United Rugby Championship and only secondarily in the Champions Cup. The Bulls have taken this to an extreme. They will not qualify as one of the Champions Cup's 4th-place teams. They will not do so because they have been playing understrength teams in the away pool matches as they try and sort out what is a priority in their season. Smart listeners will detect an emerging theme. The theme might be summarized as hypertrophy of the system, which might itself be defined as, quote, exaggerated growth or complexity. Examples of the phenomena abound. Next year's Football World Cup, for example, will feature 3 hosts, the US, Mexico, and Canada, 48 teams, and last for just over 5 weeks, which makes it 1.5 times bigger than the tournament here in South Africa in 2010. There are other football examples. The new format Champions League is interestingly designed with, theoretically at least, more opportunity given to middling European clubs in the tournament's first phase. Over and above being interestingly designed, on an intuitive level, the tournament also seems more convoluted, less transparent, more unwieldy. Nowadays, we are seeing expansion and format convolutions all the time, with the two often going hand in hand. Think the Nations Cup in football. Think of cricket's resuscitated Champions Trophy, due to be hosted by Pakistan next month, but last played for back in the mists of time, in 2017, to be precise. At the risk of repeating myself, with format convolutions comes hypertrophy. And what is hypertrophy? Hypertrophy is commonly defined as, again, quote, exaggerated growth or complexity. Confusion doesn't only reign at the level of format, it also reigns at the level of language. We have the Champions Cup, rugby, but we also have the Champions League, football, and the Champions Trophy, cricket. And let's not be fooled into thinking that cricket's Champions Trophy is the only Champions Trophy around. No, sir. There's also a Champions Trophy in hockey. It raises the question of how many champions can the world hold without those champions being devalued by the fact that there are so many other world champions out there. The Champions Cup, we are talking rugby again, in other words, if you're feeling a little bewildered as you listen to this, is not the only tournament in which it is possible to finish 4th out of 6 and still qualify for the knockouts. The SA20, that's cricket by the way, currently in its 3rd edition and taking place at the moment, is another. After the 6 teams have played each other twice, home and away, in the SA20, the 2 top-placed teams on the log play each other to establish which of the 2 will contest the final. The loser of this match will play the winner of the Eliminator, with the Eliminator being a match between teams placed 3 and 4 on the final log. The winner of this match, that between the winner of the Eliminator and the loser of the first qualifier, in other words, will be the second finalist. If this sounds unnecessarily complicated, that's right, it is unnecessarily complicated. Having 2 semi-finals, with 1 playing 4 and 2 playing against 3, and the respective winners contesting the final, is simply too simple. With the newfangled SA20 system, with qualifiers 1 and 2, as well as the Eliminator, you get 4 post-round-robin matches, including the final, as opposed to 3, including the final, in a more conventional knockout system. It's a handy way of squeezing another match out of an already jam-packed tournament. That's another day of satellite television, another day of breathless hype from the presenters, another day of punditry where the trivial is celebrated as the exceptional, and a mishit off an outside edge can, and frequently does, lead to squeals of delight, particularly if the camera pans to some doofus in the crowd who is trying frantically to catch the 6 one-handed and so earn himself a slice of the 1 million rand prize money. Said doofus is on the high wire. Literally, he is trying to keep his balance, for one, trying to keep his beer from spilling onto the fellow next to him, for another. He is also trying to catch the ball one-handed, trying to line it up alongside the mass of other hands trying to do exactly the same thing. He's an acrobat. It's a circus. We're all clowns. Hugely enjoyable it might be, but the SA20 is still a circus, with the one-handed catches in the crowd, the pageants performing seals. Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. That's the least of the circus as it happens. Get this. Last season, in the 2024 edition of the tournament, the team finishing 4th were the Josie Super Kings. They finished 4th, winning 3 out of 10 matches and picking up a couple of bonus points along the way. Am I the only one to point out that that seems a little crazy? Contrast the SA20 with the FA Cup, which we referenced a couple of moments ago. There is legislation in Britain to ensure that the FA Cup, as an event of national significance, is broadcast, at least in part, on the public broadcaster. This leads me to wonder if televising the competition on both terrestrial and satellite television has helped to ensure its longevity, because it has moved from being a sporting event to being a cultural artifact. I wonder further if the competition's history, and therefore its tradition, protects it from fundamental changes to the format. The notion of tradition is an interesting one, in that we could argue that tradition acts as a kind of protective casing or skin, which offsets fiddly attempts by broadcasters to tweak and customize and improve. The fact of the matter is that the SA20 has no tradition. It has no tradition because it is only 3 years old, yes, but tradition is anathema to such tournaments anyway. Tradition is fuddy-duddy. Tradition is the past, a world of black and white and 8-ball overs, a place where you go to hide and not be seen, which is, of course, the raison d'etre of much contemporary social media. Graham Smith, the SA20 tournament director, is rightfully proud of the tradition of the test team he captained, which once won rare away victory series in Australia and England. In 2012, his Proteas, with Jacques Cullis, A.B. de Villiers, Hashim Amla and Dale Steyn in their midst, were the top-ranked test team in the world. Such away series wins are worth remembering. They are worth remembering because it's unlikely, with Cricket South Africa's obsession with white ball cricket and their comparative neglect of test cricket, that they get to be repeated any time soon. They are also worth remembering because the team shows what a functioning system behind that should look like. And, believe you me, the cricket system in this country, with its bloated 15 provinces, doesn't look anything like what it should if Smith's side is to be generated from a functioning domestic system yet again. The tournament Smith directs now, the SA20 in other words, has no time for tradition, because tradition belongs to the past, which is a place where only tragics and the empty-headed care to venture. That the past contains lessons for the present and the future is of no import. We can do without lessons and continue to live in our present tense bubble. If the SA20 and the tournaments which preceded it, like the Mzansi Super League and the T20 Global League, can be said to have a tradition at all, in fact, it is the uniquely South African tradition of partial failure. The T20 Global League, remember, didn't even get airborne, crashing into the bright lights at the end of the runway without the wheels leaving the tarmac. Put another way, it didn't get out of the swanky Bulgari Hotel in London's Knightsbridge, where the tournament was officially launched. The sticking point seemed to be that although he had parties interested in being franchise owners, Cricket South Africa's Haroon Lorgat didn't appear to have buttoned down a broadcast rights deal. In this context, rumours arose that MultiChoice's Imtiaz Patel and CSA's Lorgat couldn't reach consensus over whom would ask who to dance. As it happens, they didn't even make it out onto the dance floor. CSA recognized, however, that a T20 tournament with a global reach was an economic necessity in an IPL age. Either they started one, or they were going to lose their nationally contracted players who would become privateers. So, amidst both pragmatism and desperation, the Mzansi Super League was born. The interesting thing here is that SuperSport was rejected as a broadcast partner in favor of the SABC for the Mzansi. CSA hoped that if they committed themselves to the public broadcaster, they would be able to leverage government funding because they were fully aware that the SABC couldn't bankroll the tournament themselves. But government didn't intervene. COVID-19 came along and suddenly, after snubbing SuperSport, CSA had a product the SABC was broadcasting but couldn't pay for. Effectively, Tabang Moreau and his cronies at CSA had, in a moment of mind-numbing brilliance, given away their inventory for free. Now we have a tournament in which the franchises are owned by consortiums and individuals who already own IPL franchises. This means that we should be cautious when trumpeting the SA20 as a national tournament because the tournament is owned by cricket power brokers offshore. In world economic and cricketing terms, South Africa is not a player. She is a follower. Being a follower invariably means that you have to compromise on your values, which assumes you know what your values are in the first place. The thing about having fourth-place sides out of 6 qualifying for the knockouts, and we're talking about the Champions Cup here too, is that it gives off the idea that your values aren't strong enough to compete with those of the broadcasters, the politicians, and the money men. Mammon rules. It's the crazy Babylonian free-for-all. Have another beer and watch it rain sixes. When you wake up in the morning, you can try and make sense of it all, if you dare. You could argue that the teams don't make up the competition rules. They simply abide by them. They don't rubber stamp format changes either. But where you get craven format changes or counterintuitive decisions around format, you get cynicism. And cynicism is the death of sport. Cynical is what some of the South African rugby franchises have become when they send second-string teams to Europe in saving themselves for one of the 2 big European competitions, usually the United Rugby Championship. Maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe it isn't cynicism at all. Maybe it's just pragmatism based on good science and good stats. Rugby is such a relentlessly punishing game that players have to be kept fresh and injury-free. Sometimes the only way of ensuring that is for younger, less experienced teams to do the arduous job of touring. But a cynical system is an unstable system. Unstable systems are open to manipulation. I have no hard proof of this, but in last year's SA20, my Cape Town's captain made some very strange cricketing decisions. In my Cape Town's match against Paarl Royals in Paarl, Kieran Pollard won the toss and decided to bowl on a pitch where it is widely accepted that it is difficult to chase. One of the most destructive finishes in the modern game, which is why he was there in the first place, Pollard batted himself at 7 in this chase, lasting 2 balls and scoring a duck. Both Dewald Brevis and Connor Esterhuizen batted ahead of him. In my Cape Town's match at St. George's Park against the Sunrisers Eastern Cape, the visitors chased, with Pollard scoring a relatively sedate 24 runs in 19 balls. In the end, with Esterhuizen and Sam Curran at the crease, they failed to get over the line, but only just, losing the match by 4 runs. Generally, I find, when runs are needed, runs are found. I might have dismissed my suspicions but for the fact that one former president of an upcountry union phoned me to share his. I also, without soliciting, received another call from a cricket insider wondering whether something wasn't wrong and whether I noticed anything amiss. I had. We swapped notes and promptly forgot the conversation. I noticed that Pollard hasn't returned this season, with the team being captained by Rashid Khan and helped along by Colin Ingram and Rassie van der Dussen. This, of course, means nothing, although the general point hovering above it all remains. Obtuse formats, competitions that run in parallel, broadcasters and offshore owners that wield too much power, weak administrators who are bullied because they are unsure of their ground. It all adds up to a cynical system. And to reiterate my earlier point, cynical systems lack credibility and, because of it, are inherently unstable. As a format, T20 cricket remains uniquely vulnerable to manipulation and match fixing, particularly if tournaments are beamed in real time into India, where betting is illegal. Remember the Ram Slam Challenge, anyone? In 2015-16, that edition of the Ram Slam Challenge provided us with the biggest match-fixing scandal in South Africa since that of Hansie Cronje. It featured not only Ghulam Bodhi, the kingpin, and a raft of disenfranchised players from the Lions, including Phumi Mashikwe, Jean Symes, Alviro Peterson, Lonwabo Tsotsobe, and Tami Tsolekile, but also one of their chommies, Ethi Mbalati from neighbours, the Titans. The Hawks have slowly been sifting through the evidence ever since, and in late November last year, it became known that they had arrested Mbalati, Tsolekile, and Tsotsobe, the latter two on 5 charges of corruption each. Their cases, apparently, will be heard at the end of next month, so in February 2025, in other words. Ever since the match-fixing issue was brought to the attention of Cricket South Africa's anti-corruption unit by whistleblower Vaughan van Jaarsveld, Tsolekile has been the most recalcitrant and aggressive suspect, insisting on his innocence. He has even played the race card when necessary. He has what he claims is a legitimate beef, in that he believes he was promised the Proteas' wicket-keeping spot after Mark Boucher's freak eye injury against Somerset in 2012, but we all feel aggrieved and mistreated in one way or another. It doesn't mean we all indulge in corruption. The arrest must be very sweet for anti-corruption investigators. They have been on the case for 8 years. We do not know why those arrested and charged in the Ram Slam attempted to enrich themselves. Motivation is made up of a mass of motives, some good, some bad, some as yet unrecognized. Here was an over-politicized, poorly managed and unstable system, although the format wasn't that great a concern as far as I could ascertain at the time. Some of the players who cottoned on to the lure of easy money were simply scared. Some of them were injury-prone. Some of them were nearing the end of their careers with nothing to fall back upon. The lure of, quote, cash in hand, as Bodhi memorably called it, was simply impossible to resist. So where do we find ourselves? There is hypertrophy everywhere, often manifested in bad formats, like that of the Champions Cup and the SA20, as compared to working formats like that of the FA Cup. Hypertrophy is bad for sport. Fans, who are naturally intelligent, feel disrespected. Players, who are naturally canny and self-interested, feel taken advantage of. Sometimes such systems crash. More often than that, meaning simply dribbles away. A tournament is not what it once was. A tournament never becomes what it might have been. Competitions do not grow in credibility, they simply stagnate. When fans feel disrespected and aggrieved and unheard, they vote with their feet and walk off to find something else. Players who experience these things more intimately and viscerally than the fans, for obvious reasons, take matters into their own hands. When this happens, you have match fixing, you have generalized skullduggery, you have doping scams. When you have these things, nobody wins, and sport itself takes months, even years, to recover. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.